Training seminar on evidence-based policymaking here at the UI in Florence, and David Mair from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission is here. And what we already heard in the discussion are different facets on evidence and policymaking, why it's important to have evidence in policymaking today. And that's actually something that we would be interested in, David. Why do you think it's the time now more important than ever before to inject evidence in policymaking?
It's an incredibly important question, Gaby. We need to think properly about why we want policy to be informed by evidence, because there are other alternatives. Some people want policy to be based on gut instincts or emotion or religious text or whatever it may be. So if we want our policy making to be informed by evidence, we need to understand why that is incredibly important and argue for that as a value, because there are competing values in the world today. And I think the case rests upon the fact that ultimately evidence or science and knowledge, it can tell you about the reality we live in. So if we are to make policies that work for people, that deliver on the values they want, and we don't waste money or they don't have unintended consequences, then ensuring that we know what is out there that we're trying to change and what is the likely impact of our changes on it is the only sure way to make sure that we have ultimately policies that work for the people that vote in elections. It's becoming harder these days, I think, for many reasons. I think the world is becoming much more complex. The world of policy, the world of knowledge is becoming much more complex. And still we look for simple solutions which will solve these problems. So we need the evidence to help us make sense of this complexity, but it's very complicated to communicate this complexity to voters and help them make clear decisions. And I think we're reaching this point where this is becoming a real challenge, how to communicate the complexity of the problems and in the solutions that we're coming up with is a real challenge in today's world.
Talking about complexity, with your experience from the European Commission, but also from the UK government you worked in previously, was there somewhere a turning point where complexity was confronted in a different way in policy making, where we sat from rather the factual or the just instrumental part, we went into analyzing complexity differently? The background is interdisciplinarity something that kicked in only in recent years to become important, or is that something that was of concern when thinking about facts and evidence for a longer period?
I couldn't pin an absolute date on when this happened, but certainly I've worked in public service for 20-something years, and what I see much more now is that policy discussions involve many more policy interests around the table. The good old days when problems arrived in neat department-shaped boxes are gone. Instead, you need to see what are the consequences of your environmental policy, on your agriculture policy, on your climate policy, on your energy policy. People are much more aware that a policy in one area will have consequences on other areas, and they need to avoid unintended consequences. So there is a growing realization on the policy side that these problems are interdependent and complex. They're not linear, they are emergent. And interdisciplinary research, I think, is an absolutely fundamental part of being able to deal with that policy complexity. I don't think we're terribly good at it still, because what I can see is that there is a strong drive in academia towards specialization and therefore a fragmentation of disciplines. And there aren't very good structural incentives in academia for the people who want to work across disciplines. On top of that, the practice is really hard. We discovered this recently in a workshop that you and I both attended, where when you bring together people from different disciplines, they don't immediately even have the same understanding of words, and you have to work very hard to establish a common language. But it's clear to me that in terms of coming up with good analyses of the problems and solutions, interdisciplinary working is essential. But also for politicians. Politicians can't really deal with a piece of isolated science or knowledge. They need joined up science. They need a bit of natural science, a bit of economics, perhaps a bit of behavioural science, perhaps a bit of other social science. They need an integrated package, otherwise they can't deal with it in the political process.
How can academia, and especially research centres and the Joint Research Centre in particular, contribute to that? What activities do you run to improve the community of multi, or in the best of all cases, interdisciplinary work to inspire progress in evidence and policy making?
So we have had recently quite an important strategic refocus, and we are moving towards trying to integrate knowledge around policy problems. And therefore the starting point in getting that right was, rather than trying to organise ourselves according to scientific disciplines, instead was to organise ourselves according to policy issues. And I think that's a very powerful way to automatically start to draw in different disciplines. And we've done this by setting up what we call knowledge centres, which are virtual exchanges of knowledge where people, policymakers with different policy problems and researchers from very different disciplines with part of the answers can come together and share knowledge. So we have a knowledge centre on, for example, migration and demographic change, which includes an incredible array of different disciplines working on that problem, which is itself a multidisciplinary problem, but also a multi-policy problem. So I think building around common purpose, and the common purpose being a policy theme, and then building communities of both people who need the knowledge and who can provide the knowledge, is the most powerful way to bring about this interdisciplinary and inter-policy coordination.
How do you think this can trigger down in traditional education, higher education institutions, in universities? Is that a model that we can apply for our research in our everyday life in universities and research institutions? Because this is quite demanding, to be really able as a political scientist to talk to an economist and understand the same things. Is that a model for the future, or is that a model rather for activities that are steered by institutions like yours?
I have worked with a number of institutions, academic institutions, who are thinking along these lines. I'm not an expert in it, but it seems to me the incentives in academia, whether it's from publishing or employment, are not strongly driven towards this interdisciplinary working. I'm not sure that the journals of interdisciplinary science are necessarily always seen as the highest rated journals to be published in. So I think there's something at a systemic level to think about the incentives for interdisciplinary collaboration. Although my optimism is that I think as universities come under greater pressure to justify taxpayer funding, being able to identify how they're contributing to understanding societal or political problems is going to be important. I think the key players in academic institutions could be public policy institutes, and sometimes I talk to these people and they're a bit narrowly focused on political science, and I think they have the possibility to be a place that can start to draw in the other disciplines that exist at the university and integrate it into generating useful analysis and advice for politicians and policy making.
Great, thank you very much. There's so much left to talk about, and I hope that we will, in our joint activities, continue in the future, and I know that we will. We will anyways report back on our training and the result of our training and stay in touch. Thank you very much for coming and for joining us at our ECT. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaby. It's a pleasure to be the EUI, and I think you're doing great work here to map out the future training regime for policymakers and civil servants. So looking forward to partnering with you on that.
Thank you very much, David.